the Virtual FantasyCon 2017. This is the panel on realism in fantasy warfare. My name is Diane Morrison. I'm the author of the Weird West Chronicles, and I'm also working on a fantasy space opera series called the Toy Soldier Saga. Some of the stories have been published, some have not yet. I chose people for this panel who had a background that was relevant, as well as who were working on works that were centered on warfare, where it was extremely important in the process of the plot. For me, my background in that is largely Napoleonic War era naval warfare is what's sort of the technology going on in my fantasy space opera. And as for my background, I'm a longtime medieval recreationist. I have a little bit of martial arts training, not a lot, sort of mixed things here and there, mostly Arnis. Really strong interest as an amateur who's read a lot of books. But other than that, I don't have a lot of hands-on direct experience. That's not true of my other panelists.
I'm Samantha Nacera, United States Navy, 1990 to 1995, Operation Desert Storm, and also the latter end of Operation Fiery Vigil, which was the eruption of Mount Pinatubo, which is why I had that damage I mentioned in my lungs. My interest in all of this is I write mainly post-apocalyptic horror, but I am in the process of, with a co-author named Bethany Bedard, working on a dark fantasy series where you've got kind of a three-way Cold War going on, where there is an intersect between roughly 1850s technology and medieval warfare and magical warfare. It's basically three great tastes that don't really taste great together. In fact, they leave quite a mess.
All right. Well, my name's Graeme A. Barber. I have nothing published yet, although last NaNoWriMo season, I wrote a book called Blackwater Station. It's a supernatural horror, near future sci-fi adventure thing. That's in the process of coming out. Aside from that, I blog extensively on a lot of things to do with fantasy gaming, world building, and so on, which is part of the background I bring to this. Militarily, I've been an armored reservist in Canada since 1999. I've deployed on Op Palladium to Bosnia and then 2 tours to Afghanistan. I also have a rather decently sized library of military studies books and medieval studies books because it's something that interests me and something that I feel helps me do better world building when I'm doing it.
All right, my name is Asaf Mer. I'm an author of historical urban fantasy. I love reading about ancient Rome and ancient worlds in general. Part of that is the warfare that happened in ancient Rome, both personal and on military scales. Personal background, I did serve in the Israeli army, but my experience, I'd say, is far more important than combat experience. It's about the logistics, which move all the armies around. And I've been doing martial arts for about 30 years now. So I have a little bit of experience with how that works on a personal level.
I'm so excited about this panel. I've really been looking forward to this since we started talking about it. We also consulted with a gentleman named Paul Westermeyer. He is a fantasy game designer, and he is a United States Marine historian. So a little bit of input in the development of the panel. He wasn't able to make the panel itself. So the reason why I wanted to do this panel was I read a book that did it really wrong. And I kind of started tearing my hair out. I'm not going to tell you the name of the book because I don't think that's fair. It was a fantasy novel that was nominated for the major Australian Science Fiction Fantasy Award, which I can remember the name right now. So she did a lot of things that I really, I was like, I made it to about 20% through the second book. I was like, okay, no, I don't even care. I don't want to know what happens to these characters. I'm not even interested. But in particular, there were some things that just struck me. Okay, so here's the scenario. There are these 3 different countries that are in conflict. The one that's in the middle is an atheist nation. They are run by a sisterhood who remind me very much of the Bene Gesserit, except with no mystical powers, for those of you who have read Dune. They're very political. and they have what's supposed to be an extremely well-trained, disciplined, and well-equipped armed forces. To the north of them is a monotheistic religious nation that is, it had a very Crusades type feel, sort of feudal. There were a lot of, different lords and priesthoods, and the priesthood itself had its own vast sort of Knights Templar order that was being rallied for conflict with this nation to the south of them. I know, right? And she had every stereotype. I'm certain. I'm a pagan. I'm certain she must have been a pagan. She had every negative stereotype, first of all, that a pagan tends to think about monotheistic religions, which there was that, right? And then to the south of them was a polytheistic nation. And the polytheistic nation were sort of, barbarian skirmishers. But the powers are real. This is the thing to understand, right? There are actual physical polytheistic deities that are doing tangible, measurable, you can see lightning flash out of their eyes kind of things. So the atheist nation, is trying to defend their borders from incursions from the skirmishers. One of the characters is he's a captain of his particular division. Oh yeah, and in addition to being captain of his particular division, he is directly related to one of the sisterhood who is running the whole country. He is her son. So one of his direct subordinates starts lipping him off. He's all like, yeah, you're, just in this position because of your mother and blah, blah, blah. Okay, they're on the battlefield. They're looking for the skirmishers in a copse of trees, right? And, and he's doing this. Okay, so tell me, first of all, what is wrong with this picture?
Everything is wrong with that picture. In a situation like that, when you're actually in the theater of conflict and somebody starts doing that, what you do is you slap the guy in irons before he completely tanks the morale of absolutely everybody else, and you deal with that stuff later.
That's right. I agree. That's what I thought too. I'm like, okay, come on. Of course. That's when the arrows started flying, right?
Man,
I'm sorry.
No, it's just the first thing that strikes me is just right off the hop in our world building, you've got a polytheistic nation with real gods, you have a monotheistic nation with a real god, and then somehow have an atheist nation between them.
That doesn't work for me either.
That doesn't make any, it's, if you have it and the religion in your world isn't something that's real and tangible, you're not literally able to call the anger of the gods down onto your enemies, then yeah, sure, you could have a nation where we're atheists, we don't believe the gods exist, blah, blah, blah. But in a world where they do exist and you've got guys dealing with them on the ground on a regular basis, that leads me to wonder how do they exist? How does their philosophy continue to exist in the face of evidence that it's
I think it's dumb.
These were the atheist troops who were looking for the guys?
The atheist troops are looking for the polytheistic
and they're supposed to be the well-disciplined, highly trained and organized group, and you have some random junior officer NCO or something like that going after the commander of the unit.
Yeah.
That does that's the sort of thing that happens in made for TV war movies.
That doesn't happen in a real chain of command.
Yeah, because even in a force that wouldn't, if it wasn't super well trained, it wasn't super organized, disciplined, if that sort of thing happened, it would still result. It will probably more likely result in violence there, because you'd have the guy who's being attacked would simply reassert his dominance by
killing him,
killing that guy right off the hop. In a well-disciplined force, how did that even become a thing, and how did it progress to the point where it's gotten to where you're arguing and fighting about it while you're on the advance? The
best case
left
scenario
is departure, the enemy is ahead of you.
Yeah.
Let's stop and discuss the politics of our nation and how our commander got here.
Right. The best case scenario is, as I said, clap him in irons and put him back there with the revs. Rev stands for rear echelon MFer. You put him back there with those guys. and deal with this later. That's if you don't just kill him outright for treason, because at that point, that is insubordination, and that is potentially treason because of what he was saying about the mother who's running the show.
So what I concluded from this is that, okay, obviously a lot of fantasy writers do not understand some of the basic principles of warfare.
Right.
And it's important that you have at least a basic understanding if you're going to write about it. And since so much of, epic fantasy, it depends on these massive armies and, everything else and these big conflicts going on. If you're going to deal with them, at least have a grasp of what you're talking about. And this is what I'm hoping we will provide for authors who may be watching this in the future. Give them kind of a, here's your 101. Where do you think we should start, guys? What do you think are important things that fantasy authors should know?
First of all, any army marches on its stomach. If you don't have enough food, what you have is a bunch of desertion. Second thing, medieval armies are disgusting because they are absolutely the perfect hotbed of weight, disease, like cholera, whatever influenza is running around that particular year. If you're fighting in the wintertime especially, local diseases, like suppose you were doing this in something that was similar to the Congo, you could easily trip over bushmeat that was infected with something really awful like the filoviruses. You have to remember that there are two things that are going to melt that army to nothing. One of them is hunger and one of them is disease. And portraying those particular threats adds to the feel of what it's like to be in that particular time period. It's not going to be people in bright, sparkly armor dancing around on their pretty white ponies. It's going to be filthy, angry men who are potentially sick and potentially have infected wounds, and they're hungry and they want this done. So they're going to want to see it done even more quickly, and that's possibly going to lead to problems in the ranks.
Yeah, I'm given to understand. I read some statistics somewhere that dysentery has killed more soldiers throughout history than all of the casualties of war in terms of direct wounds combined.
I can tell you from firsthand experience, having had amoebic dysentery when I was in the Philippines during that whole volcano thing, you betcha. I had IVs in both arms, one for fluids, one for antibiotics. They don't have that back then. They stick you in a tent, let you basically crap your guts out and hope you get better. That's all they can do.
Sounds about right. I think what a lot of authors miss is how the soldiers get to the battlefield, and then what they do once they're on there. So how to get the logistics is important.
Moving that many people, yeah.
Yeah. So if you look at any old classical army, they travel with a baggage train. So there's 1,000 fighting people, and then there's maybe a quarter of that number of slaves and aides and then whatnot carrying wagons and leading them, and then any random number of camp hangers on and followers, wives and prostitutes and beggars that just follow. So yes, an army travels on its stomach, and it travels with a lot of other people, and it takes a while to move everybody through the countryside to get there.
Yes, and it also completely destroys the countryside as they pass through, because I mean, just one battalion is going to strip anything that they come across, because military food is usually hardtack or things like that, and they're going to want that farmer's nice sheep that they see in the field over there.
Yep.
And who's going to stop them?
Yeah, they actually had often foraging parties to go and collect all those nice little sheep and then farmers' daughters in the area.
And they would garrison themselves in people's barns and houses too.
Absolutely. So it depends on the era and what's happening in the background. But yeah, so you do need those logistics, and those were often planned for in advance when the army, before they even started. And as once they get on the battlefield, that's probably more for movies, but you'd see it in books too. They all, stand in a nice big line and charge at each other, which is, that example of the officer talking back to his commander. Formation was a big thing. So breaking formation was a capital offense, because a unit's survival depended on its ability to maintain formation. And that's true pretty much up to World War I. Even in the gunpowder age during the Napoleonic War, there were formations for riflemen. and they fought in formation. So skirmishes serve a purpose, and that purpose is to harass the enemy until the actual formations can form and tackle the main body of the enemy. Then they try to melt out of the way. Skirmishes were never there to actually win the battle, do much of anything. Once you get into the formation, you don't just run willy-nilly and break into one-on-one fights, because that's how lots of people end up dead.
Yes.
In a lot of statistics, which are dubious at best from the ancient world, you get really massive one-sided casualty numbers. So yes, we know that those numbers were very likely exaggerated, but the result is that as soon as one side broke formation, whether it was morale or whether they were actually forced by some superior force punching through them, that spelled the end of them, and that in turned into a massacre.
And then there's another nasty factor of medieval warfare, and that's after the battle is done with, you have lots and lots and lots of wounded people, and you have very, very few people who can do physic or chirurgery or whatever it is, however you want to phrase it in your particular fantasy situation. So you had a group of people set aside with a weapon specifically used to punch through armor, and they're suffering.
Yeah, logistics don't end with the battle.
Right.
Logistics end when everybody's back at home.
And
After battle, the cleanup, everything is important as well.
I think what a lot of this falls under is that a lot of people, especially a lot of people who are civilians who are writing these books, who don't have either military experience themselves or they don't have historical knowledge themselves.
Right.
What they do is they don't understand the structure of how a military operates, or how a military unit or a larger military unit functions. They know what they've seen on TV, they know what they've seen on movies, they know what they've seen portrayed in popular media, basically, which is more often than not the scenarios that Asif there was talking about, where you get two lines of people that just run towards each other and break into a whole bunch of one-on-one fighting. And I think a lot of that has been reinforced in the imaginations of people, because quite honestly, that's how games like Dungeons and Dragons and popular tactical tabletop games like Warhammer 40,000, Warhammer Fantasy, they kind of work like that. You move your units around, but at the end of the day, or you move your character around, at the end of the day, though, it all comes down to pitch one-on-one fighting. And they don't understand that even into the Middle Ages, when you moved away from Roman style formations and stuff like that, there were still formations of troops, there were still blocks of troops, there was still strategy and tactics involved. It wasn't just a bunch of guys running together and everyone sort of waiting in the wings to see how it worked out. And
I think it's also enforced by Hollywood. It makes a very nice picture. It's just completely inaccurate, that's all.
It is. That's why one of my favorite movies is actually Waterloo. And it was a movie, it was filmed in the 70s, and it was filmed in the Soviet Union. The director asked the Russians if they would help support it, and they provided like thousands of actual soldiers, and then they remade the landscape.
Woo!
And so
it was amazing to watch. If you've not seen this movie, Waterloo 1970, please watch it. You can watch it on YouTube. The whole thing is on there. It's awesome, man.
Check that out. Yeah.
They have everyone is in their formations. The cavalry, there's no CG because it's the 1970s.
Yeah.
So when you see the cavalry charge happening, that is
effects.
actually a bunch of guys on horseback. And, all the Russian guys, of course, they were given permission to grow mustaches and everything else, so they looked the part. But yeah, it's so people don't really get it. And a lot of other things that get reinforced is things like they'll treat military leadership as though it's the same as like gang leadership. Like the strongest person is the person who's in charge, and they're only in charge as long as they can be that strong person. Which is
the post-apoc that doesn't work so much with what we're talking about.
Yeah, and even in like the post-apocalypse and stuff like that, like you'll got gangs and stuff like that, but eventually you'll end up with a more organized group where your authority is no longer coming from your ability to punch somebody in the face really hard.
Historically, officer class were always mostly nobility who were trained to be officers. So
right.
It's never about the
raised to be
personal ability. Yeah, but it was never about the personal ability to fight. It was their ability to and family background to buy into the lead troops. And yes, a lot of them did it badly, but it still was a certain class of officers that were not reliant on personal power, but on social power to lead the men.
That's kind of one of the things that I'm exploring in what I'm writing right now, which is that dark fantasy that I mentioned. The Crown Prince was very charismatic, but he was a crappy tactician, had a drinking problem that was burgeoning since his youth, and had a major hate issue with the people that he basically single-handedly started a war with, and that ends up in his demise.
I've got kind of a reverse scenario going on, actually, in another project that I'm working on. I'm working on an epic fantasy called The Forever Throne, and in this, it's a lost heir story, lost heir to the kingdom kind of thing, except that I'm doing a lot of twists on typical fantasy tropes, one of which is that the character is transgender through magic, but that's not really the point here. In this case, Vaughn has been training his whole life to be a tactician. He has this vast library that's been saved by the knight from his kingdom that's been looking after him and all this stuff. But what he's got to do now that he knows all this information is try to convince people to follow him. And people are not necessarily going to just follow, oh yeah, okay, so you used to be the heir of the kingdom, but now the kingdom's kind of like flattened, isn't it? So he's got to try to be political about it. So there's a complicated, who commands the army is in part dictated by politics and in part dictated by ability, and some more or less depending, right? But it's not that flexible of a system, right? Like, okay, right. in my fantasy space opera, the orcs have a tradition by which they challenge the leader for leadership, very Klingon-like, I suppose. But
well, that's what you get when if you have orcs that have any kind of technological advancement. What you get is Klingons, basically.
Yeah, pretty much.
Only if you roll with an essentialist concept for culture, but I think two things, and that's one, cultural and political sophistication within the context of medieval warfare, and how our own assumptions and how our own biases and preconceived concepts affect it, but also the type of fantasy that the story is going on in. For example, Samantha's examples come from a very low fantasy, more reality grounded concept. You have large, low magic, military forces maneuvering around, wrecking the countryside and pooping themselves to death because, half the army has dysentery. However, in a scenario that's, say, a more conventional fantasy setting or a high fantasy setting where you have magic that is effectively replacing technology and is allowing for technological, or the magical equivalent of technological advances that we take for granted, those same assumptions and same constructs don't hold up as well, and they become sort of a questionable decision on the world building side, because you're like, well, why are these guys, destroying everything? Why is everyone dying after battle? They have clerics or healing potions or whatever. They have an alternate method healing everyone up that doesn't involve necessarily waiting as long. Why are they only fighting during the day? They have guys who can cast spells that develop light at night, so you could move your forces up under cover of darkness. Then all of a sudden, surprise! It's daytime. Let's fight, and catch your enemies in disarray. So
Elizabeth Moon's Deed of Paxenarian dealt with that very well. Right now, Elizabeth Moon, for those who are not familiar, was a United States Marine.
Yes,
right. So she also has an understanding of how militaries work. And now she receives criticism for being somewhat anachronistic in that her past army looks a lot like a present day army, but there's reasons for that. She gets into it more in her second group of books around it, but for her solution to the magical healing question was that magic is expensive and not everybody can do it. You've got like 2 or 3 guys who are capable of doing healing. Well, what do you do with them, right? You use them to heal the most valuable people to the whole force, which is usually its commanders, but could be significant people for different tactical and strategic reasons.
That has some kind of specialization.
You apply the same kind of logistics and the same kind of cost calculations as everything else. It's a resource. whatever access you have to the resource, however you utilize it. People were never stupid. They realized pretty quickly what they need to do, given what they have. So apply the same principles.
And that's an amazing point, because that's something that a lot of authors don't do. A lot of people treat things as simply plug and play elements. They bolt them onto a story for a part of the story that they feel needs that element, and then ignore the larger ramifications or ignore the larger effects that it has on the universe or on the battle space that things are happening in.
In my world, I made magic pretty pervasive, and it's available everywhere. And at one point, the protagonist mentioned that there are restrictions in the harbor against using magic because, you know, competing magicians trying to speed up their boats led to too many crashes, and everybody got annoyed with them. So no magic in the harbor anymore.
Which makes sense. Like that's
yeah. If you want people who can manipulate weather, that's what you get on the other end. You know. And if your people are so rare that, you know, you only have 1 or 2 people, then they're not going to spend their time healing everybody else, or they're going to be, you know, somewhere in the back, like the siege engine, only pulled out when they needed to make maximum use of their abilities, not exposed otherwise.
Right. You protect those people because they're one of the most valuable resources you have.
You make the balance. You make what's the cost, what's the availability of the resource, how is it going to be utilized, and then try to imagine the ramifications of that.
The framework that I have built up, there is a small specialized group of clerics in this big breadbasket of a nation, which is the human nation of Tamiris. So you have that very specialized and very rare resource there. You have the elves, who they're not going to use their magic for anybody except another elf. Not to mention they are the smallest, but one of the more powerful forces because of the level and amount of magic they can bring to bear. Then you have my partially demon people, the Ashtori, who live in the volcano. A lot of their magic goes to controlling that volcano so that it doesn't go Yellowstone and lay waste to everything, which is something that the other nations aren't aware of. But their magic is based on 2 things, and it's blood and fire. Blood magic is expensive. For a blood mage to be able to actually say, suppose somebody broke their leg and he was so essential that they had to have that leg healed quickly. This particular blood mage would either have to draw from multiple people, or he would have to have a magical item and do repeated draws and cast into that item until he had enough of a power base to be able to heal the leg. That's expensive to do for him. He doesn't want to cut up his friends. He certainly doesn't want to have to continually cut up himself. So this person had better be really essential before he's going to agree to do that. The orcs, they don't have very much magic. What they have is shamanic, and usually used to propitiate a very perpetually angry goddess. So you got the shamans over there who are kind of doing their thing, while these people, what they got is guns. What they got is tech. So they're extremely low magic, lower even than the humans as far as that goes. And all of these factors are coming together. It's all about to come to a head over the food that's in the human kingdom and access to that. So that particular battlefield is going to be an ugly scenario indeed, as the elves finally come out of their forest and start bringing all of that to bear while being shot at. The people that live in the volcano are going, we are really close to letting this thing loose, and it is the ultimate artillery piece. We don't want to go there. This needs to end now.
That actually brings up 2 good points there, right? Now, the first one comes back to an army marches on its stomach, so how are you feeding them, right? And the second one is, why are people doing this? What's their motivation, right? It's so easy to have just the big bad who's being the big bad for the sake of being the big. Nobody's the big bad just because they're the big bad. Everybody is the hero of their own story. They're doing it for a reason.
Right.
And very rarely are we actually in a scenario where a whole nation is going to go to war over the whim of one person. It does happen.
It has happened.
It has happened. It will happen again. But more often than not, it's because the will of the people are behind it, right? Like at least at least the nobility or whatever, right? They want to see
there
war.
Has to be some social authority is what there has to be. There has to be something to say, hey, we're going to war. we support it. You guys should support it too. Everybody grab your stuff, helmets on, let's go for a walk. But I think one of the things with that is, like, for armies moving on their stomachs and stuff like that, moving back onto the logistics side of it, you know, it is possible for an army to move on, you know, having very low logistics strain, and we know that because it's been done a lot in the past. They simply destroy the countryside as they're going along because they're foraging. I find a lot of times many authors opt to completely ignore any sort of logistical support for their armies in the field. Like, it's, for example, in David Eddings, like the Malorian series, this is a second series with Bulgaria there. Yeah, you know, you have like the untold hordes of whatever show up. And all I could think to myself reading, like, okay, so you're looking out, you just see a sea of guys in like red tunics. It's like, who's feeding all these guys?
Yeah, right.
Like, you're out in the middle of a plain. You've got, you know, an army that is counting, like, you're in the, you know, tens, if not hundreds of thousands. Like, who's feeding these people? How did they get here? What's going to happen? Like, they're not all going to leave.
Even a zombie army. A zombie army doesn't need to eat. But somebody's got to control these zombies.
Zombies
right?
also have a problem. They rot.
Yes,
They
they
fall
leave pieces
apart.
of themselves behind. They probably are carrying diseases. Even if the zombie army is marching and you don't have to feed them, guys have to control them. It's like a herd of sheep. People, you know, zombies are going to wander off, you know?
Yes.
Right? What happens when the necromancers go to sleep? Like,
Yeah.
you got to have plans for this stuff, right?
You got to have necromancy shifts.
Yeah, that's right. And the other guy's sleeping in the wagon, right?
It's like it's those little things that make the difference, I find, between like a conflict in a fantasy novel where you're like, wow, like this makes a lot of sense, and one where you're like, how is any of this working? Like, they're riding meat-eating dinosaurs. What are they feeding the dinosaurs? You know, they're utilizing dragons for air support. That's fantastic. Dragons are awesome. What are the dragons eating? How did they convince the dragons to show up to do this?
Kudos to George R.R. Martin on the dragons. You want to do dragons right,
Yeah.
He's doing dragons right.
Yeah, no, he's done a really good job with dragons. But
I have dragons going on in mind, but they're not controlled by anyone, and they are a huge threat. They've been displaced from where they normally live, and now they're making incursions, and people are FUKT.
So now and that's another point. Natural disasters.
I actually found surprisingly one of the best fantasy post-apocalypse settings, at least in the early days of it, that didn't just work, but actually worked fairly well, was actually the Dragonlance setting.
I didn't read that.
Because it was a post-apocalypse setting. You know, the cataclysm had happened, you know, the world was struck by a meteor, the gods left, all that sort of thing. But they kept everything to scale. Even when, like, massive armies appeared, there were explanations about them, like where they came from, how they were eating, how they were surviving, all that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So there's that bit small amount, it wasn't a large amount, but that small amount of logistical explanation to it. And it helped immensely with the book.
Actually, and there's another point, okay, right? You said, let's put our helmets on. Let's go for a walk, right? This is the thing. Armies have to get to where they're going to fight.
Yes.
I mean, you know, nowadays we can fly drones. Up until recently, we had to walk.
Yes.
Or we had to ride.
Yes.
And I've heard this a lot, but I'll say it again. Horses are not motorcycles, okay? You cannot just put food in them and they go. They're animals. They have personalities. They might get obstinate. They might get sick. They might wear a shoe. Yeah, they might spook, right? There's specific things you have to do to train them in order to make sure that they're not going to spook under given conditions. A trained warhorse is an expensive and valuable commodity whose training is every bit as difficult and expensive as your most advanced warriors. If they don't eat, you're not going to get very far, so you got to feed them first. Grass might be good enough where they are, but you don't know that that's going to be the case in the battlefield, so you have to bring grain for them.
And it's going to get eaten down. That's the other problem. It's going to get trodden under many, many hooves. The grass is going to be there for long.
And the other thing is too, right? Like, okay, if you ride the horse continually to get where you're going, it's going to be tired. It's only going to go so far. Right?
Yes.
So most people, when they traveled, had remudas, which was a group of horses that they would take, you know, they would change which one they were riding and which ones were carrying the stuff and which ones would rest when they were traveling. There was none of this lone knight on his horse crap. Did not happen.
Horses wearing barning with a knight on top of them wearing armor are gonna tire a lot more quickly than your basic foot soldier who all he's got is a pot on his head and his poor little pony. Poor little pony's probably doing a little bit better because he's not carrying as much weight.
But most guys were walking.
That said, that's another misconception that knights were heavy. You can see on YouTube, take a knight in full plate armor doing cartwheels. Yes, they were heavy, but the way it was distributed, they were mobile. Mobility wasn't.
It was critical.
Yeah, it was critical.
Yeah.
Probably a good segue to another issue, which is context of weapons and armor. You see a lot of that being violated in books and movies, where the wrong weapons are used with the wrong armor, and it just hurts. When weapons were developed to counter particular bits of armor, and armor was developed against particular bits of weapons, and fighting styles changed because of that. And it was always in context. When you try to mix and match, it just doesn't work. I think the most notable thing is the uses of swords. Everybody in fantasy.
Yes.
Armies,
thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, armies didn't charge using swords, with the exception of the Romans. Armies charged using spears. And armies, for the vast majority, were chainmail, not anything plate-related. And it had its usage against weapons, and other weapons were developed against those particular bits, like maces or flanges or whatnot. So when you look at it, and it seems to be, whether you involve magic or not in the battlefield, when you have the masses of the armies, right, the foot soldiers, they need to stand in formation with a shield and a spear, sword hanging by the side. They fight in a particular style, with particular weapons that aim to do a particular job. It's not that, oh, let's all wield our swords and fight duels one-on-one. No. That's how you end up dead usually.
Medieval recreationist, right?
Yes.
I'm 5 feet tall, I weigh 120 pounds, right? And I am fully capable of fighting with breaks on and off for 4 or 5 hours in full chainmail armor and a steel helmet of 14 gauge steel on my head. I have done it. It's fine. I don't have any problems doing that. Yes, it's maneuverable. Where the problem can come in, swords are a specialized piece of equipment, right? You have to have special training to use a sword. Also, they're expensive. So not everybody in the army had swords. Most of them had, spears for charging, like you said,
or something,
and you
like
have to trade information. Any kind of polearm, right? Or their hand-to-hand stuff tended to be stuff like maces, which were much more easy to use because that's the other thing about these armies, right? Most of them are levied. Like you have a few guys who are trained, knights, and then they have to levy their forces from the people who answer to them in the feudal chain of command. Lots of these guys are conscripted. They've had very little training. You can't just, here's a sword, go fight, right? That's nonsense.
So that was actually also been covered part of what I wanted to talk about and add another thing. So first one is in fantasy, horrible tendency that I notice is mixing and matching levels of technological sophistication and fighting styles and treating them as if they were mutually compatible. I mean, you can go on. Yeah, exactly. You can go onto YouTube, and if you watch how Viking reenactors in Scandinavia use their weapons versus how medieval warfare reenactors elsewhere are using theirs when they're doing it within the context of how those weapons were used. For example, with that particular example, if Vikings encountered people who are wearing plate mail, their fighting style becomes a lot less effective because it was geared to deal with people who are wearing, at best a chain shirt and a helmet. They're not wearing leg armor, they're not fully protected, and so they've got all these nice, lovely meaty bits you can chop into. Later battlefields, you have people who are wearing armor all over, they're fighting in formation, they're fighting now with different weapons, different reaches, different capabilities. They don't always, you can't sort of like rank medieval fighting styles, say like, okay, well, these guys are the best, and these ones are the best, and these guys.
It depends on, what's the situation?
Yeah, what's the situation? What influenced their fighting style? Because
what is the environment around
climate, technology, enemies around them, all those sorts of things are going to influence how you fight. So a guy who learns how to, who's geared up to fight in, say, West Africa, is going to look completely different from a guy who's geared up to fight in Northern Europe. To rank them and just say, oh, well, this guy is going to be better, it doesn't make any sense.
It's a matter of effectiveness, not a matter of better.
Yeah.
He might be the most skilled man, ever in his particular environment. But if you transplant him to some place that's 30 degrees colder and is forested when he's used to fighting on a savanna, he's probably going to stink on ice.
And that's it. Like, you can't, again, it's not a plug and play thing. And the other
Right.
one is standing armies and conscripts. Because, standing armies, they are expensive and they are dangerous.
They're disciplined.
Yeah.
They're trained.
I won't go that far.
Yeah.
Hopefully they're well disciplined. Hopefully they're well trained. But in reality, it is a lot of people standing around who are well armed who aren't doing anything. Like there was a reason why, like, for example, when the United States came to be, they didn't want a standing army. And it's because they'd observed, historically speaking, standing armies, if they got bored or decided they didn't like how things were going, would sometimes decide to, change the situation. And so,
carve out their little patch in the mountains and make the peasants give them money. Yeah,
like they're
give them food.
You'll have nobles, you'll have kings, you'll have all those sorts of people, and they'll have that small cadre of regular troops, the guards at the castle, the people who escort them around, that sort of thing. You don't see giant standing armies, and that's a weird anachronism that gets transplanted from modern concepts of militaries into fancy ones, where it's like, well, sure, the elven army would deal with this. Like, well, why do the elves have an army? How do they have an army? How are they supporting this army? Where's it coming from? It's the goblin army. How do they have an army? How, how is this a standing force that's just going to rise up and come out of nowhere to go fight? And then with conscripts, that very much was the way things were for a very long time. You went to war and you gathered up a bunch of people, and they could either volunteer or be voluntold. And it's just this whole standing armies and fantasy thing. Like, if you can write it and make it make sense, that is fantastic. It's great. But a lot of people don't. They just assume, a nation has a military, so therefore there should be a standing army, there should be a standing navy, there should be, Griffin.
There is an old, or historically, term of the campaign season, right? So you start the wars at spring after the snow's melted, and you try to be back, in time for in autumn for
the harvest.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
That was actually the pattern things followed in Afghanistan. There was the fighting season, and it started roughly after everything was planted, lasted until everything needed to be harvested, kicked off again for a little bit, and then when it got too cold, it slowed down.
It happened most of the story. So.
Yeah, the thing that I have with my specific orcs, they do have a standing army because they are a standing army because they are a martial society by nature. And this particular part of their history, they're stable this way. They are an army by nature, by being orcs.
My orcs are expansionistic conquerors, much in a similar, they do have a standing army as well. They're a very martial society. They have a fighting aristocracy, right?
Yes.
The women do everything else because the men are all fighting, and actually that's a social issue that gets dealt with later on. But and it's a plot point. But they're constantly having to go in and take new territory in order to feed this standing army as it exists. The space elves demilitarize between wars, and what remains acts more as a policing force that tends to, deal with pirates and, take taxes and things like that. That's how I deal with the problem. But yeah, it's a problem, and you need to think about solutions like that if you're going to write about standing armies.
Right.
Asaf, do you have anything to add? You're the logistics guy.
I'm not logistics. I was actually HR in the army, so I was happily stamping green little piece of paper.
Paper needs stamping.
Yeah.
Otherwise, nothing works.
Especially if it's green. Yes. The point of standing versus conscript armies is true. It's true throughout history, and it should be reflected. Again, it comes back down to logistics as well. If you have those people and they're not pulling their weight in making food, which is what most people were concerned for most of their lives, which is, just make food, then somebody else needs to make that food and make all the things that they could have done as artisans and whatnot, pay for that army. So where does that come from? How does the society function in general to support such an army? Why would they make such a sacrifice? I mean, take all those people who could be contributing and just send them. I mean, that their contribution as a standing army has to be greater than their loss of economic benefit.
Yeah, there has to be some kind of existential threat that's driving that.
That's probably diverging though from realism in warfare to realism in economics. Is another sorely lacking thing. There's this meme going around the internet about, the Middle Ages technology dropped, and if the Roman Empire didn't fall, technology would have been, no, technology advanced fairly well in the Middle Ages. Technology actually advanced more in the Middle Ages because there was a need for it. Suddenly there wasn't an empire that could ship all the grains from Africa, from Northern Africa, to feed all the poor in the city. So they had to start farming, and they had to farm in poor soil further up the mountains. So they developed technology, and they developed the moldboard, etc., because it was no longer cheaper to employ slaves.
Well, the way I have Tamir set up, that human kingdom that's such a breadbasket, they are very, very fertile, and they have spent a lot of their motivation keeping it that way.
So if you have a resource abundance, then you suddenly have lots of people that don't need to deal with sowing and planting and harvesting and milling the corn to make bread. You suddenly have all those people who can do something else. So again, it's a matter of economics. The princess, rape the peasants for the last gold coin to pay for the army, for the standing army. It's like, that doesn't tend to last long. I think the feudal system, as it's depicted in fantasy, existed for such short and isolated periods in history that it's not even funny.
It just doesn't work that way. And,
mostly it doesn't. So
I think a lot of that is because people have a very very American view of how aristocracies work, because America has a hate-on for anything to do with a leveled society, even though they've replicated one very effectively in the US.
Very catastrophically is the word I would use.
Yeah, and so for example, if I'm watching, I can guarantee any television show that I'll watch that comes out of the United States that has to do with the American Revolutionary War, I can guarantee that any British officer who's depicted on that is going to be a monster. They're always depicted, they're petty, they're insane. Here, guys like Simcoe in the United States, he's this monster. Up here, we're like, he was a good officer who went on to continue to command troops and do stuff later on.
Don't forget the leading British officer, George Washington. He was properly trained by the Brits. Sorry. They just sprinkle some salt there. No, actually, I had a friend who just wrote a novel based on what would happen if George Washington actually chose the Brits. There's an alt history novel. He came from what we were discussing earlier, an officer class. He was raised amongst the rich to lead people. And he was no different from the other side, from the Brits. He just chose to fight for one cause versus another.
That whole thing where it's this very influenced view where, aristocracy is always bad. And that one tiny window in history when, in like the very early Middle Ages when everything was super dysfunctional. And that's like people zoom right in on that. That's it. That is the Middle Ages. Like, well, what about, the centuries of, relative, sure, there's lots of combat, but there's also a lot of stability and a lot of,
it was a pretty well-oiled machine.
Yeah. And, everyone just sort of like, we don't look at that part. We just like this one little early bit where everybody's running around in the ruins of the Western Roman Empire, trying to carve out their own little niche. Or walk on to that, the odd examples is like, well, Baroness Bathory was awful. I bet you all nobles were like that. You're like, well, no, they really weren't.
And the other thing too is when they don't focus on that period, they always focus on something that's happened after another period of destabilization. Right? George R.R. Martin, in part, took a lot of what was going on in Westeros from the War of the Roses. Well, that was an unstable situation that ultimately stemmed from a drop in temperature that happened over the world in
a little ice age.
the Little Ice Age, which of course affected growing seasons and made an economy of scarcity and created a chain of events which eventually resulted in this big political conflict. It happens in a different way, right? The Mongolian horde existed under Genghis Khan because of 10 years of record good weather in the Mongolian steppes. So there was lots of food for the horses. So all of a sudden they had all these horses, and now they could go out and do things with those horses, which created another destabilizing situation, which is not the normal.
And within the context of our discussion here, the logistics within medieval fantasy warfare, that raises a lot of questions about, simply when you're doing a world building, when you're doing your storytelling, how, what are the influencing factors politically, economically, climate-based, and so on. But yeah, it's those sorts of factors. How are people moving around? How are things happening? And then, one of the things, especially if you get into high fantasy, right now you have magic that is supplanting technology, or that is allowing, technological equivalents to exist in a fantasy world. You run into people not considering the larger ramifications, like, for example, the introduction of airships and the equivalent of trains.
Yes, this is a good point, and I'm glad you're bringing it here. Magic and its effects, right? We've done a lot of talking on historical warfare, which we've largely based in real-world historical examples. So what happens when you introduce magic or, magic-type technology into the mix? How does this change things? How is it used?
Well, a big part of it works off of what Asif was talking about earlier, and that's the availability of magic inside your setting. In a setting where things are relatively low magic doesn't really affect how things are going. It's not going to really affect, in a giant way, how your character is going to go about doing things, how warfare is going to happen. It'll have some effects. For example, if you have someone who's able to scry things or something like that, your ability to scout and your ability to develop an intelligence picture before you end up and enter the battle space is going to be phenomenal. That can be mitigated with other factors. But the minute you start getting a lot of magic in, and you start getting magical technology involved, so things like magically powered airships, magically powered trains, all that sort of stuff, very, very few authors sit down and think, like, what happens when this technology gets introduced? Trains revolutionized warfare. Like their ability to move people, equipment, and materiel from point A to point B radically changed how conflicts could be fought. It was no longer a case of, we have to have
almost 100 years to make this change, right, from the Napoleon War to the First World War.
Exactly.
Really meaningful change. Even something as disruptive as that, it takes time to circulate. It takes time to build up the network of railroad and everything.
Absolutely. Building that network up. But the thing is that a lot of people tend to treat it as well as it'll be invented by one group and then completely monopolized by that one group.
Due to technical difficulties beyond my control, I'm going to have to go.
Well, Samantha, thank you very much for being part of the panel. You've been a really, just really awesome, and I really appreciate everything you've had to say. Such a valuable voice. So thank you for taking time. I'm sorry you have to go early, but how magic is used, and whether one group monopolizes it, which is what often seems to happen.
Once somebody develops one form of technology, the people around them are generally taking notice of it. And if you have a situation where you have competitive nations or competitive groups, especially ones with a history of conflict, if you look next door and all of a sudden you see, like, oh, hey, look, the kingdom of fill in the blank has just launched an airship and they're flying it around. We should probably develop either something to counter that or something, or our own version of it, which is, what happens in the real world. But instead, you just get this scenario again and again where, oh, these other nations and groups just sit back, they're like, that'll probably kill us in a few years, but we may as well just stick with our method of combat. And they just call it a day on it.
So now we have a magical arms race, or at least we should.
Yeah, there should be. I mean, if you look all through history, the developments of technology were very quickly picked up on by everybody. whether it was, when the Romans were constantly losing naval battles to the Carthaginians until they got a hold of a Carthaginian ship and discovered the Carthaginians had very helpfully marked all the parts and how they fit together. They had a manufacturing system.
The Romans actually built several fleets, and they sank. And then, they built a second fleet, and it sank too. And their actually greatest tactic was turning sea navals into land battles.
Mm-hmm.
They built a massive bridge with a hook at the end, and their ships would sail next to the other one, drop that bridge, the hook would sink into the deck of the other ship, and they could march across and turn it into a land skirmish. Yeah. And that they knew how to do. And that's how they
were good at it. But it was, it's things like that. And, how does it change the battle space that's going on? I mean, if you have, the magical equivalent of a helicopter gunship floating around over top of a battlefield, you've got a wizard riding a griffin or a magic carpet or something, who's firing fireballs or, firing wand blasts down into packed formations of troops. How is that going to change how you're fighting? Because you're not going to keep on sending your guys out like, don't worry, we'll clog the battlefield with bodies. We'll win eventually.
You can see it with war elephants, actually. So, okay, war elephants don't, breathe fire, but but part of the thing is that they did have a structure on top that they carried with missiles. So, people throwing missiles, etc. from them, plus, the morale effect of having something as large a noise as an elephant. Obviously, their importance is grossly overstated in popular culture. By the time Hannibal made it across the Alps, he didn't have as many elephants as he started, and they were good for terrorizing the country, but they didn't actually do a lot of damage. But when the Romans in the Third Punic War took the war to the Battle of Zamato to North Africa against them, they just developed tactics to work against elephants. And the tactic was simple. They made a lot of noise, which made the elephants run off in random directions. And the other tactic was because they were fighting in formation, they actually left gaps just behind the front line. So as soon as the elephant charged, those gaps opened. The elephant kept charging straight across the battlefield and never to be seen again. And they closed rank and advanced on the waiting Carthaginians. Like I said, people don't just sit there and see, that'll kill us. They think, what can we do? And they develop tactics and they use what was available. So they didn't have elephants, but they had something else. They had superiorly trained soldiers that they could enforce these tactics and build those manipulations. It's probably something that we discussed earlier, but for the importance of formations and everything. When this is what you have, this is what you use. When you have magic, you would use that to the best of your abilities.
So then the question becomes, how do you effectively use magic in that structure? What do you do? Say you have a bunch of wizards, right? Do you use them as artillery, or do you, where do you put them? Right?
I think there's a big bias on the part of a lot of people, and it gets reinforced constantly through video games and popular reading stuff, and that's magic users are always placed as static artillery. Like they're positioned on the battlefield, they will shoot into the battlefield and then get moved away if the battlefield starts getting too close. And I think that it betrays a bit of a lack of creativity that people just stick to the same trope and the same concept again and again, because there's no reason that, within your fantasy world you couldn't have your magic users be different. Like, what if they're more like Gandalf? They're equally comfortable hitting things with a magical staff or stabbing the things with with a sword. So there's options, and I don't think they get explored often enough. Sort of, you end up with a lot of books and a lot of worlds that start to feel a bit samey after a while. Like, you'll open up a book, you're like, oh, right on. Oh yeah, magic users in the back.
And you have to decide, for starters, who has the magic, right? Is it the common soldier? Is it the unit leader? Is it only, a couple of people in the whole army? And extrapolate from that. So look at other resources that were available at that level. The common soldier had, his shield and his spear and his armor, and he also potentially had bows and whatnot. And, well, you develop formations and tactics that are applicable to that, okay? If everybody has a sword that can cut through armor, nobody will wear armor. If it's just a few people, okay, what are the scarce resources that, took a lot to build up? War elephants, siege engines, okay, we can extrapolate from that. But, like Graeme just said, could have been spies, could have been, if somebody has the ability to cast magic and cloak themselves or appear someone else, that will get used. People, we're not stupid. They paid a lot for spies and they paid a lot for intelligence. Hey, that's another thing we can pay and get. Sure, let's do that.
Here's the thing, right? Is it all lightning bolts, or are there shape change magic involved, right? I have a magical spy in my war story, right? He has shape changing magic.
Yeah, and that brings up something I cannot for the life of me remember the name of the book series or author. Like a part of me wants to say Glenn Cook with his the Black Company books, but it might have been somebody else. But at one point, the characters in the book in one of the stories encounter a group of mercenaries, and at first they're a little bit cocky, and then Buddy warns them off about them. The reason was because they were specialists. They were troops who've been trained to fight under wizard war conditions. They received special training and had special equipment to fight and survive on a battlefield where wizards were present. And it's that's one of those things that Asif was talking about there, that logical development of tactics. Like, okay, well, this is happening on the battlefield now. We don't have a resource to match it. We don't have our elephant equivalent. What do we do?
Yeah, very good point.
In the same way that armies potentially could have developed, in modern warfare, that would be snipers, right? You develop something to take out key units. That could have been the commanders, that could have been the elephants, and that could be the magic users. And if you have battlefields that are routinely controlled by magic using wizards, then yeah, you might have specialized units to take them out.
Yeah, I don't know why this doesn't translate, right? Like role-playing gamers. Okay, yeah, role-playing gamers, a lot of the tabletop role-playing game tropes tend to translate into fantasy fiction, we find, especially high fantasy. There's a trope that never seems to translate, which is, hey, my guys, when I'm playing a game and they've got a wizard on the other side, we get the toughest SOBs we've got with, big hammery things to go hit that guy a lot until he dies. That's the first one that gets killed because he's the most dangerous one. He can do vast area of effect spells that, blow up half of our number in a single blast. So no, we got to take him out.
And then you get the equivalent of the Praetorian Guard who stand around him looking
exactly.
Nobody can get it. It's an arms race.
It very much is an arms race, and I think one of the things that Diane just brought up there is a good point, and that's, I think at the point that we're at right now, it is very, very difficult in many cases to separate fantasy role-playing and fantasy MMORPG type games from the fantasy genre. We're at a point now where it is getting harder and harder to find people who are writing fantasy who aren't influenced by them. Because you look at if you read fantasy coming from the 60s and 70s and even into the 80s there, before Dungeons and Dragons had exploded as completely onto the scene, and before a lot of the tropes and biases, stereotypes, all that sort of stuff that sort of run rampant, and it's a very different read. They're writing about different stuff. They've got a lot of different concepts running around, whereas you see the material that starts coming out more in the 90s, the thousands, and now, and you see a lot more of those influences at work. And part of it is understandable. I mean, it's a very quick and easy way to build up a world and to create something, but then you start finding gaps and you start running into issues like we're talking about here, where how does this army get along? How does this happen? Where's the tactics? Where's the logistics? Yeah, it's just, I think it's something that we should bear in mind as readers and reviewers and stuff like that when we're looking at things, that these influences are reaching sort of a point where you can't get away from them.
Yeah, that is a good point. And if you do go too far from them, maybe people will start to question what you're doing, even though we know that's a trope. For
my blog there, PSA Gamer, one of the posts that I'm working on right now is concepts of fantasy warfare, because you look at how things are portrayed. Elves are they're hit and run tactics, this, and orcs are, mobs, and dwarves all fight with axes and so on. But when I look at it, I'm like, well, why would dwarves fight like that? Why would they choose a weapon that requires a large amount of space to use when they're primarily fighting in tunnels? And so how would it work? And, in my mind, at least, I saw them as fighting more like Romans, with large shields and formations able to maneuver through.
Specifically, the Roman formation was developed against the Greek phalanx, so they knew how to get around long reach weapons.
And the other thing I thought was, for example, elves, they're always portrayed as fighting in, the sort of hit and run ambush tactics, all that sort of thing. And I thought to myself, like, you know what? Elves would be the most absolutely terrifying army to fight because they cannot afford to take losses. Like, if you look at elves in most worlds and most novels and whatnot, they live for an insanely long period of time, and they have the lowest reproductive rate on the planet. Like, they're almost always dying out, or they're almost always on their last legs. And so if they get into a fight, they can't afford to lose anybody. Like, every elf lost is a major blow to their the ability of their community to operate. They're going to go all out. Like, they're going to go from 0 to 11 immediately.
Yeah, and they're not going to obey any rules of honor. Like, none of that nonsense.
They're going to murder everything and everyone. And getting on to what Samantha was talking about, weapons of mass destruction, elven high mags is almost always involved somewhere. And if you have them fighting against orcs, their traditional enemy, you're fighting an attrition war, a war where they can come back and attack you every 16 years or so.
Thank you for bringing that up. This is a point that I do deal with in my, elf orc space war.
Like, why would you have elves trying to fight a conventional war? Why would they be trying to fight in a conventional environment when it's detrimental to their long-term survivability?
Yep, maybe just taking out the whole species would be a good idea. It becomes easy to think that. Destroy their enemy so completely that group, if there were any survivors, would be like, you know what, we are never going over there again. Because last time we went there, they wiped out half the kingdom. Yeah, you really have a good point. Social aspects, culture, and biology have an influence on how you're going to approach warfare.
Yeah.
It goes back to the same underlying principle of always check the economies. And, you have resources, they have an effect. And if you tweak something, if you change something, then it will have a flow-on effect on everything else. If it's longevity, or if it's magic, or anything else, or availability of any resource to make weapons, it has an effect. It has a follow-on effect.
Yeah, and it's so it's something that I find a lot of work and a lot of effort goes into describing how amazing everything looks, or how amazing these battles are. But if you look at it through perspective, like, how would this group actually fight given the terrain, their limitations, their manpower, all that sort of thing? How would they actually fight? And most times it doesn't go the way that it is described. Yeah,
that's another thing. Terrain is a thing. Terrain is a thing, right? Okay, Battle of Agincourt. Historical battle, right? Really significant. What won that war was mud. Right? Mud decided that battle. It was that simple.
Mud and very basic fortifications.
A lot of people think that the British longbowmen with the arrows, pierced and then disabled all the knights. And it's like, no, actually the knights survived pretty well. That they didn't worry too much about arrows. They were worried about so many arrows coming down on them that they might actually get through their eye slits. But arrows in general don't pierce plate mail. And even if they do pierce plate mail, they wouldn't get through the gambrosum that's underneath it. So it wouldn't really damage the person. But not all the horses were as well armored as the knights. And that was imperative. Yeah, the mud. The knights just couldn't get through the mud to get at those archers and break them. So.
When you think about the hail of arrows that are coming down, arrows are not necessarily for individual striking, they're not sniper weapons.
Oh, in the sense of warfare, it's to whom it may be concerned.
It's formation fighting.
Yeah, they're area suppression weapons, right? That's what they are.
It's not coming down. Most of the time, it's actually flying straight.
Yeah, that too.
You do not shoot it at a 45 angle, so it sort of, flies in the cloud and lands down. You shoot it straight. Usually it's a much closer enemy to break the cavalry charge or break the formation so that your troop can punch through. Archers, etc. Yes, that's how they're traditionally used.
I don't know what more to say about weapons of mass destruction, because my imagination is pretty good, and I can come up with all kinds of horrible ways in which magic could make planets blow up and things. So I don't know. I mean, how powerful is your magic, right? Can your magic create weapons of mass destruction? If it can, that changes warfare significantly. Now, I've recently done a lot of reading of classic science fiction, and a lot of the things that I've read, some of them are right turn of the century science fiction, you know, H.G. Wells, and these are modern people. We do not think of them, you know, we think, oh, that's a million years ago, right? You know, 1900 approximately, around there, right? We're like, it's a million years ago. No, these are modern people. These are modern people who were aware that they had the power to blow up the planet. They thought it would be gas that would destroy the planet and various chemical weapons, but they had the same problems that we did. They were aware of peak oil as a concept. You know, they knew it would run out. They were concerned about that. They knew that things that they had done were having effects on the climate even then. And they were as existentially concerned about these things as we are. Now, a high magical culture, maybe even more, because there's the first time it happened, right?
No, just Victorian London was filthy. The Thames was open sewage pretty much. So yeah, they were very much in their faces to see the effects of industrialization on the planet. And for
this
us,
is the thing.
It's 10 miles away, so it's actually even further removed than it was for them.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. You know, and this is the thing, right? If we're talking about magic and vast armies, you know, how powerful is your magic? You know, what can it do? Are you capable of sending a magical gas that will go and wipe out an army? You know, D&D spells, Dungeons & Dragons spells can be pretty scary at the higher levels. And what does this mean? How does this affect the way your cultures who have access to these powers think about things? They might have the same existential terror that we do.
The sky is effectively the limit. Like if you're writing medieval fantasy and you have high levels of magic in it, you can effectively replicate any modern WMD that you want. You know, you could have the equivalent of a nuclear blast without the radiation. You know, or you could have the radiation. You know, maybe that's part of the spell. But it's one of those things where the sky is the limit. If you're rolling in a more low magic environment for your fantasy, I think you'd start seeing more of things would start going more the biological and chemical route, and it wouldn't so much be weapons of mass destruction as it would be persistent agents. You know, it'd be things that you'd use. You'd see more things like, you know, the poisoning of water or riverways or waterways. You'd see, you know, the use of, you know, plague corpses being used for to try to spread plague into a besieged area, or, you know, or something as simple as salting the earth. You know, like you fight through an area, then you salt the earth so that you know, it can't be effectively reused for some time. So I think you'd start seeing more of that. You know, or what you might even call terror weapons, like Greek fire projectors and stuff like that. Things that aren't particularly effective on a battlefield in the grand scale of things, except for their psychological component. Because, I mean, like, a Greek fire projector is not going to be able to hit a lot of guys, but the few guys it does hit are going to freak out the guys who are around them.
Which is why it was so useful in naval warfare more than in area. And
with naval warfare, you have the extra bonus of trying to set the enemy's boat on fire.
Exactly.
It gives the captain a whole new set of headaches to deal with.
You have a smaller unit, and suddenly, you know, the thing that they're floating on is on fire. So they have far larger worries.
Yeah, and you can take that right into your space opera, because the same thing is true of a spaceship, man. If it's on fire, you are in trouble. That's a big priority right there.
It's like, vehicle's on fire. We got to go.
And that actually brings me around to one more thing that I thought was of particular interest to discuss in terms of fantasy warfare, which is, two things. One is, at what point are they not medieval people anymore if we started with the medieval world with all of this stuff and all of this access to magic? And the second thing is air power. Air power in magical ways. There are many ways to do that.
I think for determining whether or not, you know, whether they're still considered medieval or if they could be considered modern people, to be honest, I would base it off of, I would probably base it off of sanitation.
There's a good thing. That's a good point. Yes.
Because it's like, I would say it would be the ability to live in a clean environment, whether they have toilet paper or the magical equivalent thereof. And, because if they have effective sanitation, that means that there's sewer systems or there's some sort of equivalent that's been built. They've hit a level of technological and cultural sophistication to be able to start clumping large groups of people together and not have them all die of cholera, every few years.
That was part of the thing that made Rome great. It had sewer lines. And that will allow the city to grow to about 1 million people, which was unheard of in the ancient world and pretty much unheard of till the, I think, 17th or 18th century, till you got another city of a similar size in the Western world. Yeah, so is important. I like to lend my protagonist in that, but that's completely different. And I think the other thing is is mentality. People weren't stupid. People looked around.
That bears repeating. We often have this arrogant attitude like, oh, we're so intelligent and developed. No, we're not. We're just the same as human beings have been throughout history. They're all just like us.
People in ancient worlds knew that if you travel close to a swamp, you get sick. So they associate it with the air of the swamp rather than the mosquitoes. Because, hey, it's a mosquito bite. It's nothing, right? No, that actually mosquito in the swamp carries the disease, but they couldn't know that. But they did make the connection between traveling next to a swamp and getting sick. Or the point you made before about the atheist nation, if you suddenly have someone who can rain down the fire of the gods, then obviously the gods exist, right? People weren't stupid. They didn't necessarily have all the information that we have, but even in the modern world, people with all the information that we have still draw the wrong conclusion. It's mentality of how the society affects it is very important. You're trying to represent a somewhat alien mindset to modern sensibilities, which has to be balanced because otherwise people do complain about it. I do get occasional comments about, my protagonist being misogynistic, and it's like, what are you talking about? He's extremely advanced for a Roman. This is practically, doesn't care that some of the women are out of the house. It's a balance, right? But I think that mindset, makes it critical when you're trying to portray a world and the people in it. Yes, you have the logistics and you have everything following effect, etc. But also consider how does it affect the way people think, and in a fantasy context, that could be the magic, right? How does the availability of magic, whether it's pervasive or not, how does it change their magic? How does it change their attitudes towards religion? I mean, if the magic comes from the gods and the gods come down in all their glory on a fiery chariot and then tell you you're wrong and stomp on you, that's one thing. If magic is there but there are no gods, people might still continue to explain it in terms of gods. Because what's the difference from a natural occurring hurricane to a magically occurring one? It's a storm or something that we explain with gods, and same with magic. It's another potential natural phenomena. But that's not the way that people might think about it. Probably goes a bit more than simple warfare, but it's a society, and why a society fight might again have an effect on it, and how they fight would have an effect on their mentality and how they approach things.
I think going back to something that Diane mentioned there, we're very much similar to the people of the past. And that's, the question of when does a person stop being medieval? When does a person become modern? I think a different way to approach that is, what's the definition of a modern person? Because you can point to different parts of history and different civilizations and so on, where you had, a lot of the things that we consider to be progressive today were the norm or existed. You can find, and in our society, you can find the same progressive and regressive cultural groups at work all the time.
For me, that definition was that existential awareness that we have within our grasp, the power to create or destroy ourselves, our species in entirety, our world in entirety. For me, that was the point at which we became modern people, that awareness.
If that's the definition that we're working with for this,
that's for me.
Well, it's within the context of this conversation, is it gives us a place to work from. For anything that's happening in low fantasy or whatnot, they're probably never going to be able to never become a modern person. However, the minute you start involving, gods who can smite the planet, high magic or whatever, in your writing that is capable of laying waste to the world, all of those people under that definition then would become modern people, because they realize that, the angry overgod may decide to drop an asteroid onto the planet, or, because it's happened before,
Sure, but for me, it's a different matter, right? The angry overgod always could drop things on the planet. I think that there's all kinds of things which were huge natural disasters, great famines, entire cultures wiped out in a generation. That's happened all throughout human history. When it's somebody else's power by which that could happen, that's not what I'm talking about. It's the realization that we have that power. That this is our power.
Fantasy, that would be the ability of, the High Cleric to call on his god to destroy
okay, touche.
The nation next door, or it would be the, in Final Fantasy, what was that spell? Meteo. Your main spell is to drop meteors from space onto your enemy.
I know, right? I was like, what? Okay, sorry.
Yeah, like that's the sort of thing that I'm talking about. Like that, the moment you have that level of power available on the world, and you have people who can call on it, under that definition of, do we understand, modernity to be when we start to grasp that we ourselves can destroy the planet? It has started right then for them. Like they do not need to make the technological leaps we did, because there is some dude in a tower somewhere, surrounded by books, who has the ability to destroy thousands of kilometers of space around him.
And that's where we have to change how we start to think about things, right? Because thoughts about modern warfare are often tempered by, okay, what's too far? What is the step that's too far? How far are we willing to go? A lot of things in modern politics, we choose not to start fights because we know that it's likely to go really south really fast. And, you start talking about the N-word being nuclear, and it changes the way we deal with things. We put up with a lot more crap from nations that we believe have nuclear capability, but the awareness that they could, unleash this massive, vast, destructive, horrible thing makes us go, maybe we should just kind of,
which is one of those things we were talking about earlier in fantasy, preconceived ideas, and that's all through like literature, games, the entire spectrum of fantasy media. It is literally littered with characters, organizations, and beings that have the equivalent of WNDs, but because most stories are told in the heroic mode, you're telling the story about the heroes defeating whatever, no thought is given to the politics of it. Yeah, why would the king give it? It's like, what, that wizard over there could destroy everything. I'm going to send a bunch of random guys to go attack him. See how that works. That wouldn't happen in a world where there's any sort of political thoughts going, because you're like, what? If I don't stop people from attacking that stupid tower, that wizard is going to destroy everything. So I'm going to build a fence around it, and he can do whatever he's doing in there, and we're just going to stay out. That would be a more logical reaction, on the political side of things.
Right, and if they do decide they're going to take out that wizard, they better be pretty confident that whatever they've got is going to do it in a big fell swoop that the wizard does not see coming. And now we're talking about, mutually assured destruction again, right?
Yeah, which again, that falls into the economics and the availability of things. It's who has what available and
what are they willing to do with this. So.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, air power. Magical air power. Dragons, griffins, your wizard on his magic carpet. How do they feed them? Let's start with that. That's the first thing.
That's always my number one question. Like whenever it's like, oh yeah, we've got dragons. It's great. I mean, J.R.R. Martin, he dealt with them. It's like, yeah, they've got dragons. They also have this huge amount of livestock traveling with the army, so the dragons have something to eat.
Yeah, and sometimes that doesn't do it, right? The dragon, takes off. There's one particular scene where, no spoilers, but, the dragon does not eat something that's authorized, and then what do? You're going to have this, you got to deal with the dragon. How are you going to do that, right?
And on dragons, depending on the author and the world, are the dragons intelligent? In which case, are they animals that have been subdued somehow and are now being used as the equivalent of the ancient war elephants, or are they intelligent actors in the conflict themselves? Like, why do they care enough to take one side over the other? Like, I think air power is one of those things where it's people who haven't seen it in action don't really understand how much it changes a fight, because when you have a fight on a relatively two-dimensional plane, where your infantry and armor and everybody else are fighting, You have to be able to see the enemy, get around cover, maneuver around, all that sort of stuff. Whereas air power can come right down on top of something. Like they can look down like, oh, there they are. We'll attack that.
The Gulf War, the first one, changed or exposed it to the public exactly how that changed. Initially during World War II, I don't think the effect was as noticeable as weapons became more sophisticated. But that's also due to the rise, I think, of intelligence. One anecdote that I remember reading about H.P. Lovecraft was that he was writing about all those remote places with the elder gods, and that was the days before satellites. We no longer have unexplored places on this planet. Yeah, okay, the bottoms of the oceans, but it's not like we can find an enclave in Antarctica or some hidden island with King Kong on it. We have those maps, we have those intelligence. If you have aerial units in a fantasy context, again, do you just use them to rain fire and blasting? So do you actually use them to fly quietly above and see where the enemy is and where the plants and where are they planning and how do you access them? And maybe, just walk around that hill and ambush them from the other side.
Not to mention scrying, which is another thing that Graeme brought up earlier, crystal ball and your, psychic intelligence. You're going to have that too. And how are you going to use that? That's a thing, right? To keep in mind. Yeah. If you've got aerial units, those aerial units are probably going to be able to, unless you do something to counter them. So again, you got to go back to this magical arms race. How are you going to counter the aerial power?
In my magical world, I specifically left out scrying or any long-distance communication because when you look at ancient worlds, I write they were based around ancient Rome, but if you look at the ancient world, long-distance communication was a significant problem, probably throughout the Middle Ages as well. So I specifically left it out because I felt that if I add long-distance communication of any sort, the scrying or whatnot, anywhere near reliable over long distance, that'll change the ancient mindset that I wanted to preserve so much. Right? If I write based on ancient Rome, it's not just the marble statues or the gods, it's about the mindset of the people. So I cannot have something as long-distance communication, aerial support, etc. that would change it. So I had to be careful in what the limitations are on the magic in the world, even though it's reasonably pervasive, but some of it cannot be done because crystal balls do change a lot, how we look at things.
Yeah, and like that, absolutely. It's the minute you introduce, you look at a lot of, especially space operas and whatnot, they strive to recreate the Age of Sail. The captain and his vessel sent out untold thousands of kilometers out of communications with, a one-page set of orders to go do something.
Sounds really familiar.
Yeah.
Well, I have a magical fantasy space opera like that. Long-distance communication is a thing, yeah.
People sort of underestimate a lot the effects that long-distance communications have because, especially if you're waging a war in a fantasy world, if your army is fighting, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of kilometers away from their home nation, you're looking at days to weeks between getting information. So your commanders are going to, we tend to have a very centralized idea of command now because of the amount of communications that we have. Like when I was overseas, had you wanted to, the colonel in charge of our organization could have contacted my vehicle directly, and looked on a satellite readout and said, okay, that call sign's right there. We're right here. I'm going to talk to him. And that doesn't happen within medieval warfare, and within most fantasy worlds, that doesn't exist either, but they'll still treat things like that level of centralized control can still exist. So, we have orders from the king, like these orders are like 5 weeks old. Even
as late as World War II, there were all kinds of mistakes that happened because people were not in the position that people thought that they were in, right?
One of the great failings in France was the command HQ during the invasion of France for the French army had no radios. Like the officers they had in charge, I think the first one was 70, and the next one was like 80 something. And they were relying on dispatch riders to get information out to the troops. And the results were catastrophic. You had troops waiting for hours and hours and hours to get information they could have had, in minutes. Yeah, communications and intelligence gathering and aircraft, all that sort of stuff, it changes how the world is going to work. Because if you can, throw a guy onto a flying animal or a magic carpet or something, and he can be back in the capital city in a day, like how that army is going to fight and how that war is going to be waged is going to be very different from if you've got commanders out with fairly broad orders and a broad mandate to simply defeat the enemy.
I think there's basically two ways that you can deal with it as an author. One is either limit it to preserve that medieval or whatever mindset, and the other is to very knowingly set out to explore what happens. If you have a medieval setting with dragons or whatnot, and okay, let's explore what happens then when you start using them in certain creative ways. I think it's the falling into that trope where, oh yeah, they're there, but we're not going to think about all the implication. That's where the failing is.
Why don't we, do you guys have any ideas for resources that authors can go to look for information that would be beneficial, and, list whatever, books, movies, blogs, whatever you got? In
terms of warfare, there's quite a lot of recreations on YouTube. So call it experimental archaeology. Yeah. So people picking up weapons, not as reenactors. Reenactors have their own limitations, but actually picking up old fight manuals and trying to recreate them and understand how armies actually moved based on ancient treatises, etc. It's quite a lot of information there. I like to start with Wikipedia, but not just reading the entry, but actually reading the reference material. And then I get a list that I take to my local library to actually delve deeper into material. Read anything, start, and it doesn't really matter where you start, just start anywhere, get a broad understanding of a topic of warfare in the Viking era or whatever. Start exploring that, start looking at all the reference material. Every time you read a good book, they will have a bibliography section at the end. That's how you know it's a good book. And you can start exploring that further and then start experimenting, start thinking about, okay, if I change something, okay, this is a view of what's happened. If I change something, what else can change? What else can develop from there?
I have to second everything that you just said there, because it was almost word for word what I was going to say. There's a lot of really good experimental archaeology going on right now, where they're trying to recreate how things were done using the tools at the time and instructions from the times, or in some cases, literally just trying to figure out how to do it with only the technology that was known to exist in those eras. And that's a fantastic resource. YouTube. I think something that I would add to that is just that if you're thinking about introducing a new element, whether it be long-range communication, aircraft, trains, anything else like that, read up on those things and how they changed the cultures around them. Yeah, like read up on the history of them. And it's going to be dry. It's going to be a little bit boring, especially if you're not particularly into trains or aircraft or telegraph wires or stuff like that. But what it's going to do is it's going to give you a really good background and a really good concept of how things started to change. And I think about the only other thing I would add is that read up on, if you're being inspired by a political or social or cultural group that is based out of history, don't just use the Coles notes on how that culture worked or how their politics or technology, all that sort of stuff developed. Really dig into it and dig into the cultures you're going to put around them and try to think of how they would interact logically, because people don't exist as just nice little blocks on a map that never interact with each other. There's always interactions, there's cultural exchanges, there's appropriation, all that sort of stuff happens. So try to think about that.
Diplomacy matters.
Yeah, diplomacy matters, yes.
I recommend reading military historical fiction that is set in your time period, especially if it's really acclaimed and recognized. I did a lot of reading of C.S. Forrester, Patrick O'Brien when I was researching my Age of Sail fantasy space opera. Okay, so read that, right? The other thing is go get your hands dirty. If you have horses and you've never been on a horse, go get on one. There's something somewhere where you will have an opportunity to volunteer or to pay someone to lead you around on a horse. Go do it. You can show up at SCA, Society for Creative Anachronism events, pretty much anywhere in the world. They will put you in crappy pickle barrel imitation armor and throw a helmet on your head and put a piece of rattan in your hand to simulate a sword or a mace. And you can go out there and you can bash around a bit, and then you can learn a little bit just about what it feels like to be in the middle of that. I mean, it's not historically accurate. It's not going to be, but it's a really good way to get a feel of it. 2 specific resources that I'd like to mention. First of all, read The Art of War by Sun Tzu. Go find a translation that is designed for soldiers and not business people. There's a blog that I check out. The guy's name is Dan Cobalt, and he does an ongoing series of informative, this is what this is actually like for science fiction and fantasy writers.
When you read up to brush up, to get an understanding of a topic is important, but realize when you're skimming stuff that there are deeper details. So always try to get the context as well. So yeah, if you want to understand the implication of train and warfare, but you don't particularly like trains, that's okay to understand in general how trains work, but get the context, get the other technological innovations around the time, metallurgy and fuels and mining, etc., because those were needed to power the trains. And it's imperative that you understand that in order to understand how trains actually worked and what's therefore the implications were in the context in which they were used. Because if you just have trains, but you have no understanding of coal mining, trains are pretty useless, right? You have to simulate somehow to operate them. So get an understanding of the subject and get the context of what you're reading as well.
Yeah, I think one lesson that people should take away from this, which hasn't been clearly stated, but which we've all touched on, is that warfare does not and cannot exist independent of either politics or economics. So you must consider the politics and the economics before you can consider the war.
If you're going to be doing battles and if you're going to be waging wars in your fantasy setting, read up about how armies are structured. Because people think, oh, a division that's 10,000 soldiers, they can all fight. Well, no, they can't. Like, there's a small number of them are actually combat troops. The rest are all the support and logistics they need. So read up on how an army is actually structured.
And not just modern armies.
Yeah, not just modern armies, because medieval armies and armies of antiquity were completely different animals with different structures and different logistical needs and different logistical methods. And realize that when you're writing your fantasy war, that there's going to be more than just, the infantry and cavalry and wizards and dragons running around in the field. There has to be a lot of other things around them. Otherwise, they can't get there. They won't be able to fight when they get there. And, jerks like us will pick your book apart and complain about it.
Yeah, that's right. Well, you don't have to know all of that. You have to be aware of it, right?
Yeah.
And the character should have the information that the character would have. You want to write about some poor villager that got dragged into the battle, you don't really need to understand a lot. You kind of have to have a grasp of what's going on in the background for your sake, but you don't need to tell everything. But if you're going to write about a soldier in an army, you better know how that army works.
And then there are repercussions as well for fighting. If you had a massive battlefield, then it's going to stink until somebody's going to deal with those bodies. Then it's going to foul up the water if somebody doesn't burn them properly or bury them properly. So,
yeah, nobody gets up from being shot with a bullet or an arrow and just goes right on. You don't do it.
It can happen if enough adrenaline happens, but there's hell to pay the next day. But yeah, most of the casualties were actually the inflammation and gangrene that happened after the battle. So take all of this into account. Think about what brings your people to the battle, the motivation and the logistics, what they actually do on the battlefield once they're there, the weapons and the tactics that are available to them, and deal with the cleanup afterwards.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. This was a lot of fun, and this was every bit as cool as I thought it was going to be. I'll be happy to answer anything that I can, and I'm sure that any of our panelists would also be happy to do that. Great. Thanks, guys. And yeah, we'll see you next time.
See you around.
All right.